Good morning. Welcome, everyone. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thrilled to be with you again for the virtual reading group. We are, it's hard to believe it, finishing Between Past and Future. This book that we've been um, loving, I've been loving reading with you for the last, months, many months. And as we all know, the book is comprised of 8 essays, which Arendt calls exercises in thinking, right? How do we think in this period between past and future when the pillars of tradition have been shattered and we must uh, learn to think again? We can't rely on tradition. We can't rely on the past, and we have to fight in a battle between past and future, and begin to try and reconcile ourselves to this world, but not in the way of Hegelian reconciliation, where you, in a sense, simply say what is what ought to be, and what ought to be is what is, and then we have no judgment over it. We have to fight to love the world and reconcile with the world, but also be willing to, at times, say there's parts of it I can't reconcile with and I have to change or I have to battle with, and and yet love the world even amidst that battle. And that's very much how she imagines the activity of thinking, which is at the core of this book. Um, the last essay in the book, which we're reading today, is The Conquest of Space and the Stature of Man. Um, this essay was originally written for a symposium called the Symposium on Space, which was announced by the editors of Great Ideas Today in 1963. Um, and Arendt, wrote it in response to this call for papers. I don't think she submitted it to them. I don't know. Maybe she did. But she often did this, or she sometimes did this, where she would see a call for papers, and she would write them because she found it interesting, not to submit to it, but just because she wanted to. Similarly, um, her essay Civil Disobedience was written in response to such a call for papers. Um, this particular essay, the last essay in the volume, written as a call for this symposium on space. Uh, I said the last 2 weeks that Truth and Politics is possibly the most relevant of Hannah Arendt's essays today, and I think that's a defensible claim. But this may be one of the other most relevant of her essays today. Um, uh, because the conquest of space is about how the conquest of space has either increased or diminished the stature of man, the dignity of man. But the conquest of space is another way of saying the practical implications of the scientific revolution and how has science, as it's changed our world, increased or diminished the stature of man. And today we could ask the question, how has uh, a, a general artificial intelligence, or artificial general intelligence, AGI, increased or decreased the stature of man? Now, of course, we haven't yet reached AGI, artificial and general intelligence, and it's not at all clear that we ever will, right? Um, but in many ways, I think this is the essay, where if you're interested in thinking through the implications of artificial intelligence on humanity in Arendt's work, this is the main place to turn. It's not the only. The final 2 chapters in The Human Condition, as well as the prologue in The Human Condition, are related to this, and it's not an accident. She's actually she she uses some of the same language from The Human Condition in this essay, and clearly when she decided to answer this question about the symposium on space and ask about whether um, uh, the conquest of space would increase or diminish the stature of man. She's thought, oh, I already wrote about this in the human condition. I should, I should write a dedicated essay on it, and this is what this is. So, I love this essay because it really does get to the very heart of this question of how science changes humanity. And it's a question that I've been working on for now 30 years. My first book, The Gift of Science, um, was about precisely that, how the rise of modern science changes the nature of human justice. Um, you know, uh, this Arendt is very much engaged in that question here, how the rise of modern science diminishes or augments or both, or how it impacts the dignity of man, right? And that's the question she's asking here. Um, there's two easy answers, right? You can say, oh, of course, science increased uh, the stature or the dignity of man. You know, because of science, we humans can go out into the universe and control the weather and extend our reach. And we can achieve things that no other earthly species could have even imagined. We can go to space and we can control the heavens and we can put satellites up there and we eventually we'll be able to build planets and maybe settle those planets. And how can not increase the dignity of man, right? But the other side of that is that in being able to conquer space, um, we begin to free ourselves from the earth and an earthly perspective. And to do this, we have to embrace a scientific approach to the world, which um, involves a universalist position or a universe perspective. We have to see that the earth is not the center of the world, and maybe even that the sun is not the center of the world. Um, and we have to understand that all things in the world are simply law abiding, data following, or data points that can be understood. And that's how we get us out of the earth and into space. And so we view man as simply a data point. He's another thing on this earth, and he's filled of molecules and filled of chemicals, and we just have to figure out how to move this thing with a human form into space. And as a result, we see man as simply another one of the uh, processes of evolution that can be worked with, but also can be superseded. Right? Man is why should man be the last evolutionary stage? And so you can think of transhumanism and this idea that we can improve man and uh, improve his sight through who knows what goggles, or making our eyes better and his health and nanoparticles and all these things. And so we see man as simply another stepping stone towards a better future, and that of course diminishes the stature of man. um, the question is, therefore, how does science transform what it means to be human? And she's arguing that the conquest of space exemplifies this transformation that science brings about. It's sort of at the time she's writing in 1963, the conquest of space is sort of the height of the scientific revolution and thus the scientific transformation of humanity. Um, what science and the conquest of space share, right, is a kind of freedom, a freedom of new explorations, freedom from the earth, a cosmological perspective rather than an earthly perspective, an expansion of our point of view. Um, so Arendt's question about the dignity of man does not, she says, is not a scientific question. It doesn't concern man insofar as we're a scientist, right? And that's a very important point that she wants to make, that um, uh, insofar as man's a scientist, man wants to constantly find new things, discover new things. Insofar as man is a consumer, they want to buy new things. Um, those are different aspects of our humanity. But what does it mean to be man? What does it mean to have human dignity, right? A question that she was always interested in, from the origins through the human condition and through here. And so she's saying that the question she's asking is a question for the layman. It's a humanist question, not a scientific or physicist question. In fact, she says physicists, qua physicists, can't ask the question of the dignity of man because a scientist requires a radical elimination of all anthropomorphic elements and principles, right? If you're a scientist, you can't say man has, you know, the highest value, because you have to look at man as simply one other data point in the world. You can't you can't have a prejudice that man is great or man has dignity. And so the very question of the dignity of man is one that is foreign to the scientist. She thinks the question of the dignity of man begins with the Romans, not with the Greeks, right? And she says it's completely antithetical to science. So on 260, she'll write, "It has been the glory of modern science that it has been able to emancipate itself completely from all such anthropocentric, that is truly humanistic concerns." That's the glory of science. We overcome our prejudice for humanity, and we look at man as simply one other being in the universe. Okay. In overcoming our prejudice for humanity, we also threaten to overcome what she calls common sense, right? Science is at war with common sense. We will I didn't say it. We're going to be starting the Life of the Mind next in 2 weeks. We have a week off, and then we start the Life of the Mind. And I think one of the early chapters in the thinking section is, the war of science and common sense. And so we'll be coming back to that. We learn, she says, through science about the hidden truth, right? We learn that through science that what we see with our eyes is often deceptive, and that there's a truth behind it. And the things we see with our senses, our eyes, our ears, our touch, our smell, our taste, that's what she calls our common sense. And the common sense is sort of the sixth sense that puts all those five senses together and gives us a sense of the world as it appears to us as an earthly human being. But the scientists, she says, ask after something else. They ask after a true world not perceptible to the layman. And thus they have to renounce sense perception and renounce common sense. Scientists deal with data. I mean, she wrote this in 1963. Today we talk data, data, data. Everyone says, that's what we all care about, data. And you sell your data to Facebook and they sell it to everybody else. She understood deeply, right, back in 1963, that what scientists care about are not appearances, but data. Data are not visible events. Data are what are provided by scientific experiments. They're not, she says, phenomena. They're not appearances, strictly speaking. Data are the raw data by which we are, I don't even know enough science to say it, but a fleshy creature around an exoskeleton with a, that goes this way and this way, and you can map where we go. And whatever our intention, we can say, well, this is what they're actually doing through the data. And so scientists in focusing on data rather than on appearance, abstract themselves from real things, from real humans, right? If they map the way 1,000 humans cross a park, their goal is not to understand any particular humans. They're trying to understand the abstraction of how humans cross a park. And we can look past individuals and individual differences and idiosyncrasies to discover laws of human behavior, right? That's sort of what social science does. And this embrace of both natural laws and social laws allows natural scientists and social scientists to understand and regulate and control the world. That's one of the great promises of science. But in so doing that, right, what the science through their abstraction and their appeal to laws does is under the compulsion of these experiments and the facts that come out of them, they renounce sense perception, right? You don't actually look where people go. You want to know what the data says is the most efficient thing. Um, and we uh and we renounce the sense perception by which we, fit ourselves into a common world through our senses. And thus, she says, the scientist actually does not encounter any phenomena in daily life. If you look at the old pictures by Vermeer of the scientist, right? The astronomer and the geographer, the scientist is in their study, like thinking. The scientist, she says, either contemplates or they do experiments, controlled experiments in a laboratory. They don't look at the world, actually. And I know that's against how a lot of us view scientists who are dealing with, empirical data. But the empirical data scientists deal with is not the empirical data of everyday life. It's experiments, it's contemplation, it's abstraction. Um, so the scientist, she says, leaves the chaotic world of common sense and flees to a structured and ordered world where things of the world are abstracted and isolated from the vagaries of real life. And thus, the scientist must even abandon human language. And the goal of a scientist is to speak a symbolic language, mathematics, to discover these mathematical, physical, or even social laws of the universe, which can only be modeled, she says, through mathematic or symbolic formulas. And thus, the scientist, as a scientist, right now, every scientist is also a human being. But insofar as the scientist is a scientist, they have to lack common sense. I love this. I mean, this is one of her, you know, she has these gems, right? A scientist has to cut common sense out insofar as they're being a scientist. They make a Faustian bargain that they gain incredible power of observing the data of the hidden world insofar as they forsake common sense and they only look at the world from a universalist, from a bird's eye perspective, from a experimentalist perspective. And this is where the idea of the Archimedean point comes in, right? Archimedes was this Greek philosopher who developed this idea that if you could create a lever long enough and find a point far enough, you could get enough leverage to lever the earth and, in a sense, move the earth. Find the fulcrum point from which you could lever the earth. And what she says is that Archimedean point way out there in space that's far enough away that a big enough lever could lever the earth is the point at which scientists look at humanity from. And it gives them the power over humanity because what it allows them to do is so distance themselves from real things and real people that they don't get distracted by phenomena and common sense, and they simply look at the data. And so the scientist has to abandon real people and human language if he wants to discover the laws of the universe. And so the truth of the question, then, of what is man, or does science augment or diminish the stature of man, is a particular kind of truth. It's not a scientific truth. Um, it's a truth that resembles a kind of agreement. Remember, we just read Truth in Politics, and she talks about different kinds of truth. There's political truth, there's rational truth, um, and the truth of what is man is a kind of truth. It's a kind of humanist truth. It's the ground we walk on and the sky above. It's a kind of agreement that we come to. Not everyone's going to come to it. It's not going to be a universal agreement. It won't command general agreement, but it becomes a pretty powerful idea when we think of what the dignity of man is. And it will frequently, she says, outlast scientific truths. Um, uh, and the point of the matter, she says on 262 to 263, is that the modern sciences have changed and reconstructed the world we live in so radically that it could be argued that the layman and the humanist, still trusting their common sense and communicating in everyday language, are out of touch with reality. what she's saying here is that it may be that the layman and humanist who have this idea of human dignity, which is a kind of general an agreement that can never be fully agreed upon, but is a agreement that many of us have and has become a foundation of our world, becomes irrelevant to reality, becomes out of touch to reality. Scientists are changing our world so quickly that the truths that we thought were core to what it means to be human suddenly don't really fit with the world. Um, and she says, does that mean then that the scientists are the new elite and that they should rule the world because they're more in touch with reality and that the humanists are ignorant? That's not her point at all. She says, no. She is because part of it is that the scientist is also a human being and they only leave behind their human beingness, their layman status, when they're being a scientist, but they're also still a human being. And insofar as they're a scientist, though, they begin to come across really fundamental perplexities, what she calls theoretical perplexities. Um, because the data that these scientists are now looking at and having ever more powerful ways of acquiring and manipulating that data suddenly cease to be ordered by our natural mental categories that we've used for a long time, like causality. Um, the new universe, the quantum theory universe, um, is is not is not causal. And that's becomes unthinkable and unspeakable in human language. And yet the scientist is still a human being who has to, on one level, speak this mathematical language that is outside of our human language, and yet is still a human being. And this is a perplexity. There's another perplexity, one that's more important to her, and I think is more important to us, which is the real perplexity, right? And this comes from the confusion of brain and mind. And this is where I think this essay becomes so incredibly relevant for the things going on around artificial intelligence today. What she means by brain power or the brain is that we can enlarge our brain power through regular AI or just automation or machines and know a lot more about the world and be able to think a lot faster, like through our computers or things like that. And in that way, technology or AI um, augments our brain just like machines and tractors augment our labor power. Um, and that can make us much more productive. But there's another level of augmentation, what she calls when the AI or the general AI or the getting close to general AI, as we're now seeing, um, begins not just to augment our brain power, but to comprehend things. Um, and start to do things, even though we created these AIs and these machines, they start to do things that we can't comprehend and we don't understand how they did it, which is exactly how ChatGPT now works. Yeah, we made it, we trained it, we know basically how it works, but we actually don't know how it works, right? It's training itself. It's taking all this data and coming up with answers that are shockingly good often, sometimes also bad, but usually quite shockingly good, and we don't comprehend it. And so we are now surrounded by machines. This is happening in the last 2 years, really happening, whose doings we can't comprehend, even though we made them. And she says this means that the theoretical perplexity, right, that the world is more complex than we can understand, has now invaded our everyday world, right? I don't know about you, but I use ChatGPT a lot. Every day, I'm engaging in work and experience in the real world with machines that I can't understand. Um, uh, and if I can't understand them and I can't express what they're doing, the world becomes something inhuman beyond the mental categories of my senses. And she says on 264, the main problem, and when she says the main problem, we should pay attention. The main problem is that men can do and successfully do what we cannot comprehend and cannot express in everyday language. And in her subtle way, she then says, understated way, she says, this should alarm the layman. Why? Why should it alarm us? Because when we are now working and living in a world that we can't understand, you know, whereas before we had more brain power and we felt like we were in control, suddenly we're not feeling very much in control. There's a kind of sense that the world is beyond us. It's a kind of world alienation, as she talks about it in The Human Condition. There's a loss of the objective world. We don't really know what things are, and as a result, the whole world becomes, you know, incomprehensible to us, and as it becomes incomprehensible to us, um, uh, the human brain, right, which is terrestrial and earthbound and part of the human body, um, is unable to uh, connect with the world, and the world, the mind begins to free itself from the brain, and we lose our groundings. We lose our foundations, right? I mean, Arendt takes this very seriously. She thinks that all thinking is metaphorical. Again, when we read The Life of the Mind, this is actually a good transition to it. She says that all human thinking, abstract thinking, starts with senses, starts with, you know, the world, and we abstract from the world. And so we're always still, even our thinking is still grounded in a kind of phenomenal reality. But suddenly we have machines that are not grounded in phenomenal reality, that are thinking in ways we can't understand. They're unrelated to the world of the senses. They defy all description of language. And we lose control, right? And that's the danger she's sensing in 1963. She says this is not the fault of the scientists. They weren't driven by some great will to power to destroy the world. They were just driven by an extraordinary love of lawfulness and science. Um, and they wanted to discover like the overall beauty of the world. They were striving after generalizations. But what they ended up discovering was that lawfulness, when you pursued it and pursued it and pursued it, was lost and it was shattered. Just like the pillars of tradition have been shattered, the very idea of lawfulness, that the world follows laws, has been shattered by modern science and now by artificial intelligence. And what that means is the physical world has receded from the human senses, um, and we are left with the idea that causality, necessity, and lawfulness are categories which are inherent in the human brain and common sense of earthbound creatures, but are not inherent in the way the world now works when it's governed by quantum mechanics or artificial intelligence. Um, the plumbers, right? The people, the mechanics, the engineers, the coders of AI, are the people who connect us between the world of human world of sensibility and this now new chaotic world. Um, but when we leave the world of our senses, she says, um, not only in our imaginations through thinking, but now in our bodies, because we're now going to be entering worlds that are now created by non-comprehensible machines. We lose our earthliness, we lose our connection, we lose our humanity in some way. And this raises again the question of the stature of man. And since the scientist doesn't care about the stature of man or the survival of man, um, it's very likely, she thinks, that this will be driven to the point where we lose the world and we lose the human world, right? Not the world. We will create a different world. And here's where she goes in the last 2 or 3 pages of the essay. And she says that the person who understood this the best was the physicist Werner Heisenberg, who wrote that the modern search for a true reality beyond mere appearances, right? That's basic science, has led through quantum physics and quantum mechanics and all these things to a situation in the sciences in which man has lost the very objectivity of the natural world, right? Because all the things that are in the world, the computer, the book, the desk, the tree, right, um, are things that uh, could now be otherwise. Our hunt for this objective reality, we discover in this hunt for our objective reality that everything in the world is something we could create. We can cut down the trees. We can create artificial trees. We can create nanotechnology trees that grow out of, plastic or grow out of some new organic substance that we create. We can build a river and we can cover over a river. We can create artificial water through nanoparticles. We can create a new planet. I mean, this is the kind of stuff she was thinking about. And the confrontation with all objective things in the world is now a confrontation with man because, the fact that this computer is in front of me is a human choice. It's not natural. And it's a human made thing and it could disappear. And she says, what this means is that we're close to the point. Again, 1963, she wrote this, but I think we're much closer to the point now. We're close to the point where everything we encounter in the world is a thing that either could be or could not be based on human or artificial intelligence decisions and judgment, right? I mean, you go outside and you see a road. The road could be there or not. You see a river, you think, oh, the river is natural, but the river could be done away with and we can build new rivers. This idea that all things in the world lose their naturalness, lose their ability to stand against us, and become, in a sense, simply reserves to be used by us, is an idea that was really developed by her first great teacher and at some point lover, Martin Heidegger, right? He called this the idea of technique. And what he meant by technique was that the Gegenstand, the objectivity of things, the fact that things stand against us, disappear, and they become simply, all things become reserves to be used by humanity, reservoirs to be used by humanity. And if we don't like them, we get rid of them. And if we need more of them, we make more of them. And so she ends her reflection very much in this Heideggerian moment with the image, an image that she uses here uh, in this book, and also similar images in the human condition, where she says, think about an astronaut shot into outer space and imprisoned in a capsule, right? You've seen this. Now we see movies about this all the time, but they're astronauts in a capsule. Everything in that capsule, every object, every knob, every piece of air is humanly made, right? Um, uh, in this capsule, she says the astronaut is like a scientist who avoids unadulterated reality and lives in a fully artificial world. And that's the kind of world she thinks that we may soon all be living in. A world separated from a human world, a world fully humanly made, but made according to scientific uh, um, uh, reasoning, and thus devoid of common sense. We can depend on we can eat artificial food, right, and live in an artificial environment. And so this astronaut shot into space, imprisoned in his instrument-ridden capsule, right, is like the man who will never see anything or meet anything that's not humanly made. This astronaut, she argues, is very much like what humans have become in our scientific age. We don't eat food, but we have calories. We don't have a home so much as an environment. Our needs are determined by sensors, our Apple Watches or Fitbits or whatever it is we wear. And to look at a man as a scientist would in this way is to focus only on his overt behavior, the way he snakes around in traffic jams, or which websites he visits and for how long, what algorithms he can be governed by. And in this kind of world, it is more unlikely, she says, more unlikely every day that man will encounter anything in the world around him that is not man made, and hence is not, in the last analysis, he himself in a different guise. And this is the depressing, the worry that she has at the end of this book, that just when Franz Kafka said that man found the Archimedean point, that point at which he has leverage on the world, he used it against himself, right? He used it to then say, oh, well, if we can lever the world, we can remake the world. We can remake man. We can undo man. We can make man in our image, but no longer in God's image. Is that an increase or a decrease in the stature of man? And she says, all our pride in what we can do at such a time will disappear, as our cars and spaceships are seen less as the result of conscious human effort to extend man's material powers, but rather as large-scale biological processes. Everything we do is seen as just part of a kind of algorithmic growth, biological processes, the way we are programmed, because simply we are data. And at this point, she says the scientific approach to man accompanies the conquest of space and risks the full dehumanization of man. Um, Seen from a sufficient distance, she writes, the cars in which we travel and which we know we built ourselves will look as though they were, as Heisenberg once put it, as inescapable a part of ourselves as the snail shell is to its occupant. We simply become uh, data points to be improved by scientists in the evolution, now humanly governed evolution, and then maybe artificially intelligence governed evolution of all the beings in the world. That's the glum outlook that she offers us in this text. It's a pretty extraordinary text, I think, written 70 years ago, 50, 60 years ago. Um, uh, I'll stop there and open it to the discussion. As always, feel free to enjoy the chat, talk to each other, argue with each other, but be kind to each other. And if you want to join us in the group conversation, go down to the reaction button and click raise your hand, and we will have our conversation. I look forward to it. Sarah, nice to see you.
Thanks so much. This is great. I was wondering if you could address Arendt's use of the term space. I sense in this book as a whole that she's not just talking about extraterrestrial exploration and outer space when she uses that term. Like, I have this feeling that she's talking about a kind of collapsing of distance in a broader sense. I mean, I think about imperial expansion, which she writes about as another form of spatial conquest. And then elsewhere, she also there's that great description of the table in the human condition as something that sort of brings people together and separates them at the same time. I think the title of this book um, also is kind of spatial in a way, like she's sort of inserting this space between the past and the future. Um, and so yeah, I'd love to just hear more of your thinking on her use of the term space. And I also get the feeling, in the table example and the sort of in-betweenness between past and future, that she's interested in sort of preserving a kind of distance, spatial distance. Yeah, I think that's all I have. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Sarah. I mean, to first say, uh, she's using the word space because she's responding to this particular contest, right? That that was announced. Um, And so, you know, it's an important question to ask. What does she mean by space? Because um on one level, what she's really talking about in this essay is not space, but science. I mean, the Archimedean point is in the human condition, right? If you look at the last section of the human condition called the Vita Activa and the Modern Age, which is the core of the book as far as I'm concerned, uh, she's talking about the Archimedean point. She's talking about Heisenberg. She's talking about the loss of objects in the world, and the loss of human dignity. Many of the same things, and she doesn't use the word space, right? And so, in some sense, she's simply, uh, in some sense, not completely, um, using this the occasion of this contest and the idea of space and the conquest of space because it has a kind of resonance, and because the conquest of space seems to suggest human dignity, right? It's one of the great things that science has given us. It seems to be a tangible, real world example of human accomplishment. And what she's trying to say is no, or let's wait a second. This conquest of space actually can lead to the opposite direction. In the first chapter of the Vita Activa and the Modern Age, so section 35 in the Human Condition, um, she talks about three different ways in which she understands world alienation, and one of them is spatial, right? It's the mapping of the discovery of the earth and the mapping of her lands and the chartering of her waters. She says took many centuries. Um, and in doing that, right, speed conquered space. She writes on 250 in this section. Speed conquered space, and so we, in a sense, conquered space, just like in this essay, it's the conquest of space. Um, and in doing so, the world gets smaller. Nothing is immense if it can be measured, she says. And so we sort of everything gets closer and closer. And yet her argument in this chapter, right, is that in making everything smaller and in conquering space, we lose the close at hand, right? So she says, it is in the nature of the human surveying capacity that it can function only if man disentangles himself from all involvement in and concern with the close at hand and withdraws himself to a distance from everything near him, right? The greater the distance between himself and his surroundings, world or earth, the more he will be able to survey and to measure, and the less will worldly and earthbound space be left to him. So, uh, in this sense, again, just as the conquest of space has this loss of language and loss of earthliness and worldliness, so too does the conquest of space between us, the shrinking of the world through mapping the world and mapping the oceans. Again, actually makes us lose the close at hand and alienates us from the world we live in. Um, so yeah, I think in both these ways, or in all these ways, um, uh, this attempt to distance ourselves from the world so that we can close spaces and in a sense overcome space and conquer space leads to the kind of world alienation she's talking about. I hope that answered your question. I think it did, but if you do you have a is there something else to it that I missed?
No, thanks so much.
Great. Denise,
Well, hello.
hello.
I
I'm going
don't
to
know if my question will divert the core of our interest and of the test, because I think it's a bit of a graduation question. I wanted you to talk a little if we can make any parallel between Plato's king philosopher and the role of science and the role of, for instance, even Chat GPT.
try.
Uh, I, I don't know if it makes sense, but as you have talked about Plato's and her disagreement with him, I saw something in there.
That's a thank can if you don't I think it's a great question, and it's actually something I was just thinking about the other night, so I'll tell you why in a second. So as we've talked about in this book and in many others as well, but certainly in this book, Arendt's loves Plato, but her criticism of Plato, right, is that insofar as Plato is distrustful of politics and the plurality of politics, which led to the death of his friend and mentor Socrates, he tries to um, impose the rule of truth over the rule of opinion, right? The rule of experts over the rule of opinion. And he begins Western political philosophy with a distrust of opinion and an elevation of truth. Um, uh, and so, you know, it's not a straight line. Um, uh, for much of post-Platonic and pre-scientific Western thought, uh, what we are still missing um, is this what Leibniz would call the principle of sufficient reason. The idea that if something doesn't have a reason, it doesn't exist. Um, uh, and that only things that are rational are, right? Which is the beginning of the modern scientific revolution. Um, and that certainly was not yet Plato's view or thought by people prior to the rise of modern science. Um, the what the impact of the scientific idea that whatever is not rational is not um, means that uh, literally um, if you can't find the reason for it, it shouldn't and can't exist. And this requires that the world be rational, right? Um, for Max Weber, right, this demand for rationality as the only legitimating uh, characteristic of the world, which replaces, of course, charismatic authority, um, and and customary authority, uh, means that you know, charismatic authority, customs get shunned out of the world. The world gets disenchanted. Now, for Weber, on the one hand, there's a good, right? That we get rationality, we get a rational world. But the negative is that we live in this soulless iron cage of reason, where parts of humanity are lost. Um, and that is one of the great trade-offs and fulcrum points of modern times. Um, the fight between art and science on those levels. Uh, so you ask about to what extent the victory of rationality, of logic, of science, and the philosopher king connect with chat gpt or artificial intelligence. I mean, again, we're at the very beginning of artificial intelligence. We haven't even gotten there yet. um, and yet you just have to look at the dreams, right? So I was at dinner with someone who's very much involved in the very high levels of AI work right now, and they're creating an AI model for health, right? And they want it to be the best knowledgeable model for, you know, replace WebMD, right? If you have a problem, I have these symptoms of this. What do I have? And they want this AI to be there to do this. And they're like, we don't want this model to be biased towards scientists and doctors because scientists and doctors often get it wrong. We want to include, Facebook chats and Instagram posts and stuff like that because, and so I said to them, well, okay, I mean, it's only as good as the information you put into it. If you put in lots of like anecdotal, non-scientific information, it's not done on tests or with with blind trials and stuff, you're going to get a lot of bad information. He's like, well, what? Who's to say what's good information or bad information? Okay. Um, in any case, the point is, um, you know, it matters what you put into these things, but a lot of people think that these AIs are going to give us the answers. They're going to give us like, you know, where we want to go. And they're going to tell us, you know, these vaccines are good for you, these vaccines are not good for you. They want answers. And that's I think part of the Platonic dream, right? The dream of Plato to have a philosopher king who finds the right answer and ignores the many opinions. Now, in this particular case, this AI would focus on using a lot of the opinions. I mean, it's complicated, but I do think that the dream is there, and I think that a lot of the danger in AI, if you want to think of it through this essay, is um, to what extent we, you know, we allow an AI model or AI to determine how we should teach our children. What's the best? Well, they'll come up with the best way to teach, right? Um, we don't even understand how they came up with it. So we now have a way to teach our children designed by a non-humanly comprehensible machine. What does it mean to teach human children that way? What does it mean to govern health by a non-humanly comprehensible outcome of algorithms? So all I'm saying is that yeah, I think that there is I think this is the danger or the worry that Arendt has, is that to some degree um we are handing over or potentially handing over a lot of the difficult act of freely deciding amongst ourselves to potentially uh inhuman, brilliantly rational, deductive machines. Now, I mean, is that a bad thing? I can't tell you,
Yeah.
but I think what I can say is it's an inhuman thing. And that's not necessarily bad. I just think that's what it is.
Yeah.
John.
Roger, just
Oh, yeah. Who's that?
just to add, there's already psychotherapy with Chat GPT.
Ah,
Uh,
yes.
there's already so as you clarified now, it may be unhuman, but it may function.
Absolutely. I'm not saying it doesn't function. I mean, there's
Yeah,
also
yeah,
there was an article in
made
the
by humans. So
yeah. I mean, there's psychotherapy done by ChatGPT, and
yeah,
I
there
mean,
is.
there's there's a whole new movement of people dating the ChatGPTs, right?
Yeah,
The ChatGPT knows exactly what you need at any given time, what words will make you happy. I mean, it's the desire to be understood uh is intense, and there's very little doubt in my mind that if we haven't already, we will soon have designed artificial intelligences that are much more lovable than most human beings. Um, what does that mean? Right? Those are the kind of questions. Is it bad? Is it good? It's inhuman. Um, I think, unless you think of human as differently. If you think of human as the kind of being that will always overcome itself and thus become transhuman, then it's not inhuman, right? That's Ray Kurzweil's view, right? That this is all part of humanity because the essence of humanity is will to power, is to constantly overcome ourselves. And if you take that view, right, then this is just one more step on the evolution of humanity. John.
Hi, Roger. I've got two questions. You can choose either one or both if you wish. The first one is the conquest of space as a metaphor. It's a military imperialistic metaphor, as if space were our enemy, or simply a nice spot to overcome and incorporate into yourself. Um, so that's one. It doesn't seem as though Hannah Arendt addressed the metaphorical aspect of the question she was asked to respond to. The second point that I want to make is you mentioned the evolution of humanity, and that reminds me of somebody I'm not sure she was familiar with, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and his notion of evolution, um, where we've gone from the lithosphere, then the emergent property of life creates the biosphere, and out of the biosphere creates human beings who, in their cranial capacity, created what he calls the noosphere, or the world of mind. It seems pretty obvious that we are at an evolutionary inflection point, uh, fully entering into the world of mind. And of course, it still depends on the biosphere. We're still biological living beings, but with artificial intelligence, there is the threat, the danger, or the perhaps evolutionary inevitability of a world of mind that is independent of human beings. So those are the two topics.
Yeah.
Either one.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I think they're both good. The conquest of space, obviously it's a um there's a kind of, it could be military, it doesn't have to be military. There's all sorts of conquests, right? Um uh um but what I think she means is that by there's a way in which in conquering space we are asserting our dominance over it, um and controlling it just like we control other things. And um she's raising the question of whether this is a positive or a negative for the stature of man. I mean, again, the obvious answer would be it's positive because we're extending our domain. And she's saying that it's probably more likely that it will be the opposite. Um, uh, so I don't think it's a military metaphor per se, but it is that in this act of expanding our domain, we actually may be, um, bringing about the seeds of our own destruction in some way. On the question of evolution, I mean, I don't know if she's read Pierre Chardin, um, and she certainly hadn't read Ray Kurzweil. I mean, some of you know I've written a couple pieces on Arendt and Kurzweil, um, and Kurzweil very much takes the same view that we are now entering a new realm of evolution. His word for it is transhumanism, not nomosphere, but transhumanism, where we overcome our human limitations, which are primarily biological, and we can change our bodies and overcome our bodies and even live without our bodies and live as pure mind. Um, and eventually we will merge with the full intelligence of the universe in what he calls a singularity, right? I mean, some of you have come across this work, some of you may not have, but that's Kurzweil's view. Um, I take him very seriously. I mean, again, I don't know if this will happen, just like I don't know if artificial general intelligence will happen, but the dream of doing it, I think it tells you what people want, right? They want to lose their biology, their earthliness, their um, uh, the parts of ourselves that are irrational, and they want, in many ways, to become purely rational and purely powerful through reason. And I think, you know, I think that's the latent driving dream of much of what's going on, along with obviously efficiency, comfort, and profit. Um, uh, but uh, but but that's where we're headed. Whether we get there or not, I don't know. And RN's view, I think, on this is as long as there are thinking humans who can think outside of this and start things anew and think what we are doing, humanity, in some sense, will persevere. Although the sphere in which it's um, powerful and where it's operative may shrink, and in more and more of our life, our humanity will become smaller and less meaningful. But um, as long as there's a place for it, it at least remains. At least that's one way to read or work on this.
Thanks.
Thank you. Uh, Jacques.
I think we've already edged into my point here, but this is only a new thought. When I was listening to you lay out the dichotomy that Arendt's talking about between the scientific and the everyday man kind of personality, psychology is an attempt to bridge that gap in some way or other, to penetrate how we get from the mechanistic scientific view of the body and the mind to an activity of some kind and a preference and stuff. Um, I wonder about your last statement about that many human beings want to give up their biology, because it occurs to me that one of the forces in the society these days is the back to nature urge, the fear that we will lose the connection to the biology and the non-rational, if you will, rather than irrational. Comments? You have any comments, Roger, on that?
Oh, comments. Yeah. I think it's a great point. Uh, one of the interesting things to look at in the, um, you know, uh, in the Trump coalition, right, is the sort of weird mixing of people like Steve Bannon, right, who are wildly skeptical of technology and and um, and think that technology is taking us away from our gut instinct and our sort of masculine whatever or whatever it is he's interested in, um and really hates the technology world in Silicon Valley. And alongside that, the sort of world of Mark Andreessen and others who, Mark Andreessen, who wrote the tech, what is it called? The Tech Optimist Manifesto. Um, that thinks that technology is going to solve all our problems and make the world, perfect the world in some way. Um, uh, how those two sides fit into one political coalition is sort of a fascinating problem or issue right now. Um,
That might affect all of us.
that may affect all of us, and the fact that they both are there, and I think that's, in a certain sense, they represent two sides of um of humanity right now. On the one hand, there's a sense that technology is killing us, is taking us away, from a healthy, I mean, make America healthy again, the Robert Kennedy Jr. thing. We have to get rid of processed foods and go back to nature and cook our own food and, things like that. On the other hand, there's, Elon Musk taking ketamine and everyone, taking drugs and trying to optimize their potential in Silicon Valley through a kind of microdosing, algorithmically, designed microdosing, etc. Um, and using AI to, determine what we eat and how we sleep and, how to exercise and whatever else it's going to be. Um, I think what's fascinating is both sides, right, come from an incredible sense of frustration and unease um with the world as it is, right? A sense that the world um is not working and is failing them. And you see two kind of radical responses to that, one sort of Luddite and one um techno-optimistic. Uh um but both driven by a sense that things aren't working and we need something radically new. Um you know uh
Well, I think
which
humanity's always been like that in some sense.
well, I mean, there are times when when culture is more comfortable with itself, and I think right now we live at a time in which many people feel that the world is our culture is failing us.
Yeah, it's
Um,
true.
what's interesting is that what on many people who are called liberals have been put in the, I think, uncomfortable and I think losing position of having to defend the status quo. I mean, that's what's happened, right? The liberals have become the defenders of the status quo. And so many people are so upset with the status quo, including many liberals, that that can't win. And that's what the politics has developed. Whether the Luddite or the techno optimist side wins, obviously I can't say, but I think that in general, um, we live in a we live in a largely tech optimist age, and certainly the tech optimists control the billions. Um, and so if I had to bet on one side, that's the side I'd bet on. But
You're going to go with the money?
well, I mean, it's not just the money; it's also as Arendt calls it, the brain power and the mind power.
Touche. Good point.
Yeah. Donna.
Thanks, Roger. This might circle back to discussion with Denise, I think, but I do want to go back to the simple fact on page 270 that Arendt talks about the fact that physicists split the atom without any hesitations that very moment they knew how to do it. Of course, anything, as you know, my background is Japan and working on Hiroshima. So anytime she mentions Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I zero in on that. But it keeps bringing me back to that question of scientists versus layman or whatever. And in the classroom, often we will have these discussions, and I come back to the point of just because you can do it, should you do it? It becomes to me that philosophical question of should we do it just because you can? And another recent example here in Australia, there was an Australian invention. Some fellow built a machine gun barrel that could shoot, I don't know, 10,000 bullets or something per second. And it's like, well, just because you can, why would you? So, and I don't want to say that that in any way is being a Luddite, but where's the responsibility, if you like, in determining, just because you can do it, should you do it?
Yeah.
Do you want to head down that path to another kind of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, which I assure you we don't,
Yeah.
having done a lot of work there. But it's still, for me, that tension there between those scientific advances versus what's actually better for humanity, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, Donna, you're asking an essential question, right? And it goes back to the preface, the prologue to the human condition, right? And She's talking about all the dangers of technology and automation and cloning and and artificial intelligence. She's actually talking about this all in the prologue. And then she comes and she says, this is a terrible prospect. It's a prospect of, a society of laborers without laborer. And nothing could be worse. And then she says, to these preoccupations and perplexities, this book does not offer an answer, right? Such answers are given every day, and they are matters of practical politics, subject to the agreement of many. What I propose in the following is a reconsideration of the human condition from the vantage point of our newest experiences and our most recent fears. This obviously is a matter of thought and thoughtlessness. What I propose, therefore, is very simple. It is nothing more than to think what we are doing. Her view is, as I understand it, that if we keep thinking, and all we can do is keep thinking, we keep some element of humanity alive. Now, you said, if we can do it, should we? And the answer is, on the one hand, obviously, we are thinking free human beings. We should have the right to say, no, we are not going to create a general artificial intelligence if we don't want to. And I guess we do have that right. But and Europe, has moved in that direction. But look what's happening. China, the US are creating it. And if Europe holds to its technology and data laws, what's happening is that almost all the major European technology people are leaving Europe and moving to, other countries, including mostly the United States, Silicon Valley, where they can pursue their dreams. And so if you don't do it everywhere, right? It's very hard to do it in one place, to stop the technology in one place, because suddenly you're at a competitive disadvantage. I'm not telling you anything we don't know, but all I'm saying is it becomes incredibly hard to stop technological innovation once the technology is there and the desire for it is there, right? I mean, just technology for this has been there probably for 50 years, but now there's the desire and the technology for it. And once you have that, it's very hard to stop it. What can you do then? Well, her view is you have to think about it. You have to think what you were doing. And in thinking what you're doing, you try and um, you try and steer it, you try and guide it in thoughtful human ways. But that's very hard to do. And I think it's very easy to say we should put a limit on this. I mean, 2 years ago when ChatGPT was released, you heard all this stuff about have a year pause or have a break or this or that. And I went to a lot of these. I even organized some of these conferences on artificial intelligence and humanities, and people are like, we need to stop. We need to, come up with guidelines and this. And by the time the conference was over, a new model was out, right? Um, it's very hard to stop it. Uh, um, you know, this raises a question of, are we in control? And, you know, um, generally, I think the answer is not fully. Uh, I don't have an answer to it. That's practical politics. I'm not a very good practical politician. Um, I think that
Come
as
on,
far as
Roger, you're supposed to have all the answers.
as far as I understand it, this stuff is going to happen, and our job as thinking people is to uh, figure out how to live with it and figure out how to keep us asking these questions and not letting them disappear. That's as that's as good as I get. So sorry. Lee.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I have two comments. One about the relevance of this essay toward the goal of colonizing other planets, specifically Mars, and Arendt would strongly oppose that, and because we're really putting a our technological interface between man and a hostile environment, and so we're whether it's in a space capsule or on or a habitat on another planet, uh, uh, we're not experiencing the environment. We're experiencing our man-made uh, uh, instruments or plexiglass helmets, and so we would always be inside. Arendt brings this up right at the beginning of the Human Condition, where she says that the most radical change in the, and I'm quoting her here, in the human condition we can imagine would be an emigration of men from Earth to some other planet. Okay, and that would imply that we would have to live under man-made conditions radically different from those the Earth offers him, and neither labor nor work nor action would really make any sense for her. And I think that that's a something that I think she's really latched onto something there, and uh, and the uh, uh, difficulties and the uh, of uh, uh, trying to colonize Mars. So uh, I think what she's saying there is really relevant. Just one more comment. I think she misreads Heidegger, not Heidegger. She doesn't misread Heidegger so much. She misreads Heisenberg, uh, and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. What is uncertain at the subatomic level, namely that we cannot uh, measure both the speed of a particle as well as position, and vice versa. Uh, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, uh, which is uh, relevant at the subatomic level, um, is not relevant to the macroscopic world. And Arendt, toward the end of her essay, seems to conflate the two. So uh, uh, that's, but uh, interesting interesting essay, and just the fact that Arendt decided to include what she wrote in 1963, that article, to include it in Between Past and Future in 1968, shows the importance that she felt the whole question had, along with Truth in Politics. She had a lot of other articles, published and unpublished, that she could have included, but she chose those two. So
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think she chose it because, like Truth and Politics, those are the two she added. Um, you know, uh, um, they are attempts to think through the human condition from a particular political or worldly event. And they show what it means to think for her. And so they are exercises in thinking in that way. You know, I don't I'm not good enough on Heisenberg. I mean, you know, she quotes Heisenberg himself saying some of these things, right? That we encounter nothing but ourselves and things of that sort. But I'll leave that for now. I think your point, which you brought up from the human condition, the introduction as opposed to the prologue, right? Which is a very important point, where she does say that the human nature is not the same as the human condition, right? And that there's nothing in human nature which prevents us from living on Mars or on a new planet that we create. We'd still be humans in that sense. But if we move ourselves off Earth, the human condition would change, right? And that's a big difference for her. and she thinks that's not impossible. She thinks it's quite possible.
Yeah.
And she still thinks we would be human beings because we're human nature, but we would not have the human condition. But what I want to come back to is, you said she would think that's bad, right? And maybe. But I would be less sure of that. What she says is, she offers no answers to these perplexities, right? She says all I can do is think what we are doing. And I can tell you what some of the consequences of that would be, which is that if we do move to Mars or move to another planet, much of the human condition, as we've imagined it, would change, and we would be humanly in a different way. We'd still be humans, but we would not be conditioned in the same way, and we would not have the same kind of action, freedom, thought as we did before, because we would now be living in a fully humanly created world, and our world would be different. I think you're right that she doesn't want to live in such a world, but I think she might also say, I'm an old German lady, and what I want is maybe not the right thing. The point is things change. She knows that. But we should be aware that if we do go and live on an artificial planet or in a bubble on Mars, right? We're going to live in a very different kind of humanity than we have lived for the last 2 or 3,000 years on Earth. And that's the point.
Yeah.
And
I think she would oppose that. I think she says we should be grateful that we are Earthlings and can enjoy the everything that we can directly experience here on Earth. So
right. And I would say the same thing about artificial intelligence, right? Artificial intelligence is threatening to change our earthly human condition.
Right. Yeah.
And whether or not, that's good or bad is not something that our end can tell us. But we can do is think it through and understand what some of the benefits and some of the costs will be. And that's where I think this essay is helpful. Okay. Hannah.
Hi.
Hi.
Boy, this is such an amazingly rich conversation. And I want to thank you, Roger, so much for your opening lecture, which I'm going to insist my husband sit through when we drive.
Don't blame me on Valentine's Day
I'm
for that
sorry,
one.
but it's too illuminating. You were too illuminating to just not share. I have such deep thoughts about a couple of things. I always feel just as stupid as any human being can feel when I think about the people who are able to produce who can understand how to create artificial intelligence. I mean, there's nothing that makes me feel smaller, but in any event, while we were talking, I kept thinking about Freud's love and work. Freud said that they're the cornerstone of humanness, love and work. And I started thinking about Arendt and Freud, and there was really very little crossover. She had very little to say about psychoanalysis, from what I can tell. And her focus was more on the public participation in life, and his was obviously the inner drives. But I do believe that love and work may be important cornerstones of humanness. And that leads me to think of the hideous kind of surplus population that's going to be produced by AI because of the replacement of human labor with artificial intelligence. And of course, I think that replacement of human labor is the absolutely number one consideration that we as humans should give. And I thought it was very interesting that Vance, one of the leaders of our wonderful new government, chided the Europeans yesterday with this quote: "The AI future is not going to be won by hand-wringing about safety. It will be won by building." And of course, this government would say that because look at their concerns for um, uh, their own labor force. My son has got a fellowship at the Department of Agroforestry, and yesterday, 10% of them, of the 30,000 workers at the Department of Agroforestry, or the Department of Forestry, were let go. And who were these workers? Not the ones approaching retirement who ought to be let go, but the young, bright people of the new generation, uh, bringing the most to it in many ways, which was really annoying. He's not affected because he's a fellow. It's a 2-year fellowship. But in any event, and it made me think actually about one of my father's books called The Cunning of History, where he talks about how governments deal with surplus populations. And so the idea of surplus population, AI, love and work are all going around in my head, and it's very overwhelming. So that's just what I thought I'd throw out there.
Like these are all major questions. I mean, when I had Ray Kurzweil at the RN Center conference in 2010, I think it was, and he was asked this. He was like, "Well, there's no evidence that we're going to make people superfluous. I mean, there have been massive changes from farming to technology to this, and every time,
And each time people were made superfluous.
well, so, for a generation, and then
Yeah, generations a lot. Try
and
going
then new
through it.
things emerged, and so I have, I think it's way too early to tell how how this will impact us. I mean the big thing right now is since driverless cars, right? Because I don't know what the exact numbers is, but 10 to 20% of lesser educated Americans make their living through driving, either trucks or taxis or Ubers or whatever. And if they're all put out of work, that's a lot of people. And what are you going to do? So yeah, there are issues around that. That's again, I have thoughts about it as a citizen, but it's way beyond my pay grade as an Arentian. Um, but I think the idea, what I think is an Arentian question is, if our economy and technology creates superfluous people, right? Um, how do we uh treat them, and how do we uh um care for them in a human way,
Yeah,
and not just treat them as superfluous?
yeah,
uh and that's an economic question, but it's more than an economic question. It's also a question of charity and meaning. And how do we let them live a meaningful life? And it may be that you need to create an economy or a world that's not based on your job or your labor, and you may need other things. Um, and there are all sorts of interesting proposals and thoughts around that. How do you give people hobbies? How do you give people joy and meaning in life outside of their career? Um, I don't know the answers to these questions, but they are there. They're real questions. So, Anne Marie, I'll let you. Oh God, we're at 2:30. Quickly, Anne Marie.
Very quickly, if you can hear me.
Yep.
I'm really disturbed by this entire conversation, I have to say. I think it'd be interesting to read this ironically titled The Conquest of Space, The Stature of Man, written by Hannah Arendt, the theologian. I don't think she meant that title in any other way. I'm rejecting almost all the terms that have been used, I have to say. What if we dispense, for instance, with the term artificial intelligence, a term that Hannah Arendt would undoubtedly, indubitably reject? She took great pains to distinguish between mere cognition and intelligence, thinking, the act of thinking. I'm rejecting the we want, the mass desires over everything else. We don't want it. In fact, there is no we. There's we and they. I'm sorry to say. I reject the term inhuman, non-human, even inhumane. No, these technologies are, let's be clear, and Hannah Arendt would agree, anti-human. It's clear from, I think, the prologue to The Human Condition that Hannah Arendt believes that humans would no longer be humans were we to achieve this silly objective of going elsewhere. Literally, we would not be human. The task today is to fight, as far as I can tell, this kind of trend towards techno-fascism, and it is to launch a massive salvage operation on behalf of the last few people, as she clearly states, capable of doing this thing called thinking.
Okay.
The rest is the
Thanks.
rest.
No, I appreciate it, Anne Marie. I mean, you know, I think these are important, and they raise deeply existential questions. So I appreciate your counterpoint. So thank you. We're going to take a week break, and then in 2 weeks, so on the 28th, we will resume with the life of the mind, and come back to the question of thinking. There's 2 volumes, right? 2 different editions. There's the new critical edition, and then the old edition, Life of the Mind, edited by Mary McCarthy. You can read either one. I will be basing it off this time, the new critical edition, if you want to get that, by Wallstein Press. And I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt.
Roger, is this book, will you be referring to this book too?
So that's the
I
that's
can't
this
see
book.
yours. Oh,
That's
okay.
this book. That's the one I taught last time, and I've usually taught. I will refer. I mean, I have it, and I have my notes
Is
in
it
it.
by Harcourt Brace?
Yeah, but I'm
Okay,
gonna.
will you refer to the page numbers, or should we get the other one?
Well, that's a great question. I'm going to use the new one. But I think I can. You know, I will try to.
Okay, so what's
I
the new
try.
publisher? I'm sorry.
I'll try and coordinate the pages while I do so. You know,
Okay,
but I can't promise every time to do it. It's by Wallstein Press, Wallstein.
okay,
It's a German press.
okay.
Uh, it's
That'll be easier.
and that's the one I'm going to use. It's the new critical edition, and there's some changes apparently. I haven't, like I said, I haven't gone through it all.
Roger, what chapter are we going to?
We're just starting with
How far are we going in?
just 10 pages. The introduction to the book Thinking. So from page 15 to 25.
Oh,
It's
okay.
a short, or 26. It's a short reading for the first class.
Okay.